Well, he's trying to capture it on the video.
I understand.
So awesome.
Am I good?
All right, cool.
All right, he's a whiz.
So Adrian, this is going to be a really different kind of conversation because I
think
know
so.
normally you present ideas in front of people, whereas tonight we're going to kind of dig into a little bit more about where you started from, what your story is, what your journey's been in, and then tell us a little bit about this cool process that you've come up with that especially helped birth a startup. So I'm going to start off with, where did you grow up, by the way?
So I was born in Croatia, and actually when I was born there, it was the former Yugoslavia, and then it went through a war and it switched out. I lived there the first 5-6 years of my life with my father. My folks divorced at an early age, and my mom came over with my grandfather, and he started up an auto body business, and once they were secure, I came over and stayed with them, which is, to me, I always thought the typical immigrant story in the USA. But in terms of how it took me through an academic path, I realized at some point in time, what was a little bit unusual is I came from a family of no academics, and in fact, as long as they could track back the name Lenardic, no one really had more than a high school education. And that's actually unusual, as it turns out, for professors. So coming out of my graduate degree at UCLA, I was encouraged to take a postdoctoral fellowship for underrepresented groups. And again, I thought I am not underrepresented by any means. But I did, and I met a lot of interesting people there. There was the UC system who was trying to train professors to step into the system, and essentially it was like, you want to be a professor, what they didn't teach you in school. And I agree, a lot you don't learn in school, so it goes, and I'm a teacher. That was an interesting experience, and I did realize actually that in some sense that does give me a little bit of a different take on the academic process, since I didn't enter it through lineage by any means. That's how I got to where I am. Along the way, actually, my first major at college was arts, and I did that for about 2 years. And I switched over by accidentally taking a class in earth science, and I realized that in ways science is creative, the way the arts were. And I'll be blunt, I would have starved as an artist. I would have been pushed toward graphic arts, which I found not as creative. And that's where my path moved me in toward the sciences, but I retained a little bit of that artistic side. So that's kind of how I got here in a nutshell.
How do you think coming from that position has allowed you to take a really different approach in your teaching, and how has that shown up? God, let's see, how do I want to make this corner? How has that shown up in the results that it drives for your students?
Well, by virtue of the fact I had a very great family, I was put in a fortunate position, but my family was certainly not an ivory tower family. I mean, they had to work to establish themselves and to get a secure position and to do things. And for me, I guess that gives me what you might call a practical sense in the world. And when I teach, I do want what I teach the students to have some practical value beyond what it is, the specialty is, perhaps. And it's made me think about the things that are valuable beyond my own scientific specialty, that is the tool sets one can get, the cognitive skills that will help you go out and make your way. By the same token, I am certainly not one who thinks you fall from grace if you fall out of academics, that if you start in academics and you go into industry or you go into a private sector, that's great. I have no problems with that. And in fact, I would actually think, and I would like to think, I'd be depressed if I didn't think this, that the skills you do get in any university class can transfer and carry over. And that's affected the way I structure my classes and the way I think about it.
Well, I know you definitely had a huge impact on Anthony, because when we were talking about some of the things that we wanted to cover in 2018, one of the things that happens that's really different in Startup Grind for our audience members who are here for the first time is that we don't just craft programming because we think it's going to fit what needs to fit inside of the entrepreneurial journey. We craft programming because we listen to what you guys tell us are your challenges. We pay attention to where you're stubbing your toe or you're bruising and blooding up your knees. We ask you really different questions that allow us to really understand beyond even the surface what are some of the not just the skills, but the kind of people that we need to have in the chair that are going to tell the story from a perspective that's really going to reach both your mind as well as your heart. Because if you're not moving forward with both of them, you're not going to have really great results. And so that's one of the reasons why Professor Lenardic's in the chair. You know, an interesting thing that I've noticed from watching one of your presentations that you gave a room full of teachers, educators, was that watching all those educators, even though they were in the science arena, a lot of them still didn't always think with a mindset, because here I am, I'm an entrepreneur in the back of the room watching this. They were thinking with an educator mindset around some things that I'm like going, oh, if you could just open your mind a little bit, your students are really thirsting for you to find different ways to connect with them to help them understand why learning science is beneficial to them. What would you say to an entrepreneurial community who's sitting there going, okay, so why would science be important to us?
Well, that's a good question. Let me just preface it by just a little bit more in terms of my background. When I came to Rice, this is the only place I've been a professor, I actually started teaching, as Anthony mentioned, Earth 101, which is sometimes referred to as a terminal science class, which means it's the first and last science class everybody here will take. And students are required to take one of these classes. It's called a D3 elective, and the idea is that some science skill will help you. Now, that's great in principle. When I saw it in practice, and I had seen it in practice, and I don't want to be overcritical, but maybe following up on what you were saying, that things could be better. When I watched the way these classes were taught, and I noticed that maybe there'd be 80 students in a classroom, and 2 of them were going to go on to be earth scientists. Yet the class was still taught around principally earth science facts, knowing some names of rocks, knowing the geological ages. And I realized that that was doing an incredible disservice to 78 people in the room, other than giving them some exposure to science. But I'll be honest, you can get exposure watching a TV show or Discovery. That's not really what it should have been in that class. So for that reason, I structured the class around that very question. What are, in my opinion, the skills science gives you that carry on beyond science? And the first thing I will say is that if you think science is a collection of facts, you're breaking my heart. Science is a process. It's a way to think about things, to approach the world, and to try to solve problems. That's really what it's about. And I structured things around that with some examples from earth science, the way problems had been solved over time. At the same time, as an educator, I felt obligated to think about how do people learn anything, be it science, be it how to start a company, be it how to start an auto body business, which my grandfather had to learn. And I read a lot and talked a lot to cognitive scientists, people who study the brain, and they had come to realize that there are certain skill sets, certain thinking skill sets that are critical to learning. And it hit me that a lot of them fall under things that are called the science method. That's not a word I like, by the way, because it implies there's only one way to do things, and that's completely wrong. And a couple of them that I hit on that I always liked, one was experimentation, that you really have to have a good sense of how you experiment, how you do things to test your ideas. Another one was a level of prediction. Do you know what's going to happen? Another one was modeling. Modeling in this case doesn't mean what you might think it means, although there is a connection. The word model, it means a simplified representation of something, or if you like, a purposeful representation of something. And modeling is something I do. I teach scientific modeling classes. And that really resonated with me, and that's what I started thinking about, that all of us carry at some level mental models in our heads. You had one getting here. You thought you knew how it was going to go. That doesn't mean you turned your brain off as you were driving, but you were chunking a lot of information together in your mental model. And if there were impediments to getting to where you want to go, you get agitated. I get more agitated than others. Your mental model's not working out. And really, science itself is, in my opinion, and this goes back to John von Neumann, who was a famous scientist credited with helping develop the computer and game theory, which you might know about from the movie by Nash, Beautiful Mind. He said all of science is just that, modeling. And I would argue modeling is a part of human thinking. That you run ideas through your head, you play with them, you see how they're going to go to make some decision about what you should do. And all through that path, particularly as a scientist, I know, and I have to deal with it all the time, that the information I take in to decide if a particular model is correct, be it a mental model or a mathematical model, is never complete. And I think that's the other thing that wasn't conveyed in early science classes, is that you are dealing with incomplete information. Nature doesn't come up to me and scream, Dr. Lenardic, here's how I work. I have to figure that out. And the thinking skills that go into that, to me, seem something that's of value no matter what you do. And maybe my education talk that you saw sort of carried that over, and I do see that you don't have to go with one particular pattern for science, if that makes sense.
Well, you don't go for one particular pattern as an entrepreneur either, which is why we just loved the idea of being able to sit down and talk to you about process and how that could actually serve as a framework for entrepreneurs in being able to make better decisions, being able to learn how to use big data in a way where it helps them to make better decisions, being able to learn how to pick the appropriate business model by using that science process, being able to pick the right marketing message by using that same process. And I'm wondering if maybe a way for us to kind of delve into that might be to start with that story that we piqued their interest in on the little short description about how when you decided to take up skateboarding again and met a very interesting and inquisitive young man at the skate park.
Yeah, so I used to be a skateboarder when I was at UCLA. That's my graduate school, and I was actually reasonably good in my 20s. I let it go for about 15 years because, silly enough, I thought that's what you're supposed to do when you buy a house and everything. Not really. I actually started surfing and snowboarding, and a friend had an injury. And they started building these beautiful skate parks here. They look like museum pieces in terms of sculptures. And I had to go back. It was just so gorgeous. And I went back and I had an experience that maybe many of you had. When you've done something, in your mind you think you can still do it. But you go out and you do it and your muscle memory is totally off. And it's actually very frustrating because you know you used to be able to do it and now you can't. And so I needed to practice, and then, I am a science nerd, I'm okay with it. The nerd in me came out, and I'd actually acquired a lot of instruments to measure things, to make measurements. And this was also part of the teaching philosophy I had for the introductory science class, where I said, I'm not going to stand up there and lecture to these people for 50 minutes. I can't listen to myself for 50 minutes. So I actually did some experiments in-house, I actually did some measurements, and I told them the way they could do experiments on their own. So I brought what's a little accelerometer with me, because I realized when I was skating my body movements weren't efficient. And I thought I could make some measurements to see where the errors were. And I was sitting skating and an 8-year-old came up to me and he said, what are you doing? And I looked down, I was like, okay, I'm measuring my forces and acceleration. And he said, what's that? And I explained it to him, and there was a little gadget sitting down, and he's like, what's this? And I said, that's a Doppler radar unit. I'd gotten a handheld Doppler radar. Which is how the police actually measure if you're speeding or not. So it sends a sound wave, the object is coming at you, so the way the sound wave comes back will change relative to the speed. Some of you might know it from baseball scouts use it to measure pitching. Interestingly enough, the person who started that company I talked to was an engineer who actually started up on his own. And we started beta testing for him and using it in other places. That's a bit of an aside if you want to come back to it. The kid said, can I use the radar unit? I said, yeah, it's fine, go ahead. And he was kind of enamored that an adult would give him kind of what seemed like an expensive gadget. And he did, and I said, do you want to do me a little favor? I said, are your parents here, or can you maybe give me your parents' email, just because I wanted to check with them. I'm going to send you a little write-up on how this Doppler radar works. And do you mind reading it, and then you're happy to use it anytime you want? And he said, that's fine. I came back the next week, and lo and behold, he had read it. I have to twist the arm of graduate students to get them to read things I give them, and there it was, boom. Now, in retrospect, it's kind of obvious. He was interested in it, so it made sense for him to use it. And he started learning bits of the science process, and he learned Doppler radar. He's a really good skater these days, and we've done measurements on him. That got me thinking that, to be honest with myself, probably I was limiting myself in education and getting the tool set out that science can give you in general by staying in the classroom. And we decided to go outside of the classroom as best we can with what was very much a grassroots type organization. I had actually met some people who had started public use skate parks in Houston. They actually had to push this to get the city to build it. And one of the donors was the Jamail family, who also wanted the skate park to be a little bit beyond skating. They wanted it to be art, they wanted it to be culture. We brought in a little bit of science with it and started doing experiments live on the fly with anybody who wanted the education for free. And we had these students who ranged from all ages, from 8 to, we actually had a couple NASA engineers come over, set up their own experiments and learn the experimental process to learn to try to answer questions they had about the workings of the world through using a bit of a science process, quantification, doing things, testing your ideas in a concrete way, critically adjusting your thinking based on what the observations show you, which is also very much what scientists are trained to do. We all come in with ideas we love. I have theories I love that I think are great, but I know I have to actually test it out. And part of science training are ways you can test your ideas to see if they make sense with the real world, which is, I hope, a skill set everybody sees as being valuable. Now, with a science education, we formalize that a little bit. We tell you the processes you can use to do it, some mathematics you can use to do it, but inherently all humans do this all the time, and it's just a formalization of something you're doing already. And you can apply that to a range of problems. And the students at Skate Lab, right, it's, you know, the questions are, do the soles in these shoes actually help? Is my money well spent? Do they actually cushion me? And I was like, oh, we can test that out. I can give you one example if you have time.
Go ahead.
So one of the examples that resonated the most with me as to what this can do, and this is me as an educator, I don't know if it carries over to entrepreneurship, that's for you to decide. A skater, Devon, hadn't been to the park for a while. And usually when skaters aren't at the park for a while, that means they hurt themselves, which is kind of depressing. So I saw him after a bit. He was 18 years old, auto mechanic, so we had something in common. And he said he had hurt himself. He had broken an ankle on a particular trick. I don't need to tell you the particular trick, but he did it. And he said, you're a science dude, right? And I said, yeah. People had found out that I was a physics person. He said, how much impact am I putting on my leg when I do this trick? And I said, you know what? I don't know, but this is perfect. Do you want to do an experiment? And he said, yeah, and we set it up at what was called a back-to-school jam. So there were a lot of students there and parents, and we put a little wireless on him. He did the trick. It was a force meter that could measure the impact. We did some slow-mo videos. Now, that all sounds cool, but what was really interesting about the process is I said, before we do this, Devon, I want you and everybody else to give me an estimate in whatever unit you want about how much impact you think you're generating. I purposefully didn't look this up. I didn't Google it. I didn't do anything. I'm not pedantic about that. I think information at your fingertip is great because I wanted to give my gut reaction too. So we all gave our thoughts about what the impact should be. We did the experiment and we were all wrong. And we all learned from it. And to me, if I could actually say what is actually misrepresented sometimes about what science is, it's encapsulated in that. We all have things that we think are so true, so correct, they can't possibly be wrong. Sometimes we decide not to even test them out. But as a scientist, I'm trained to find ways to test them out And one of the things I need to instill in students, which I think will last for a long time, is that if the observations or the things you find out through your observations don't make sense with your a priori belief, that a priori belief is what's got to go, not the observations. You've got to adjust it no matter how much you like it.
What's a priori?
Before you go in and do anything, you think this is the way the world works without actually ever testing it, just based on maybe cultural aspects, maybe on thinking I'm the smartest person in the room. Academics can be that way, so it goes. I try not to be. Beforehand, before the fact. That to me encapsulated, and it just hit me as I was sitting there. It's like, this is the science process. This is what I wanted all the students to come away with, because they're going to forget all these facts about rocks and things like that. But that's the thing that can be useful kind of across the board, that you really think about ways to test this out. And then the next level of science, this gets a little higher level, is, and this is formalized, how do you adjust that belief based on new observations? That is, can you formalize it? Let's say I have an idea about how something should go and I get some observation about it and it locks into it. That doesn't necessarily mean your idea is 100% correct. It might not be. The next observation might go another way or another way. Science is actually the formal process of actually using those observations to update your inferences, to change your ideas, to adjust them. If you want to Google a science nerd term, it's called Bayesian inference and Bayesian analysis. And it's done in terms of probabilities, but it's a way to adjust. Also, all human beings do this too. We all do it. You want to ask somebody to go somewhere with you for dinner. You think, are they going to say yes? Are they going to say no? You take in certain observations to help you decide. At some point, you feel confident enough at whatever internal percentage, and you say, okay, do you want to go to dinner? Do you want to join my company? Do you want to? It's all there. And science is really the formalization of that. And to me, that was something that I thought would be useful across the board. Devon dug it. He enjoyed it. He said this was great. I really thought this was enjoyable. He said something that broke my heart a little bit. He said, I went through school and everybody said I was bad at science and wasn't good at it. And I just looked at it, I go, no, you're exactly what I, as somebody who hires scientists, would want. You're curious, you wanted to do this, and you wanted to actually try to literally test what you thought was correct. That's my little story.
One of the things that has always been kind of interesting to me as we've had a chance to talk and meet, and we met ahead of time, and Anthony and I y'all both shared with me some different things that you had done, is I've always thought it was fascinating how, as a science professor, you started discovering that ideas as a science professor actually aligned to the business world. And you've had opportunities to start businesses because of some of the things that you have done, for example, at the skate park. Can you share what those realizations looked like so people can see how those dots connected?
So, yeah, to be clear, the things we do with Skate Lab and some of the extensions are all principally nonprofit. So they're not necessarily business models in that sense, but they do relate. One of the things, though, that did hit me is that as a scientist, many research scientists will share this as well. I'm only paid 9 months by Rice University. Over 3 months of the summer, I generate my own funds. I generate my own research funds. My graduate students are paid by me writing grants to get research funding, to get them paid through various agencies. I have to take in that money, I have to dole it out, Rice gets a bit of it, I have to manage the people who do it, the graduate students who have a range of personalities. And maybe it was actually even talking to Anthony that made me realize that in some sense, and most research scientists are running a small little business. We are an independent business. So I have to think about the things about grant structure all the time. I have to find them, finding new resources to find them is great. I have to think from the management side and all these things that business people think about. for that reason, I've actually read books on business management. It's helped me as a scientist. It's made me realize that a lot of scientists, managers aren't doing things exactly the way they should. Fair enough. And that's not a bad thing. The thing that's got the most connection to me that I would say that let me link into some people doing charitable work, things like that, that had organizations. It sounds kind of simple, but for me it was just simple curiosity, that I was just interested in how they did what they do. And I was interested in the overlaps and the connections between it. And for them, a little bit of skill sets from my own scientific knowledge and what it's trained me, the ones I've mentioned to you, thinking about modeling, thinking about uncertainty, which is something as scientists we're trained to do all the time. Thinking about the fact that the world is not linear cause and effect, that as I do this, this happens. Science has taught you, I do this, this happens, that does this, that does this, that does this, that comes back and affects me. The science jargon term for that is feedbacks, and we study them all the time. Some are positive, they reinforce what you do. Some are negative, they actually work the other way. And we have to analyze those things. So that connection that I've seen as the people I work with in some of the charitable organizations, and I can mention them if you want at some point, I've made sure they're okay with it. They've realized that that's something they think about all the time. And having somebody who thinks about it in a somewhat more formal sense has been of value. And that's been a lot of where the connection has been. You mentioned data, big data. So as a scientist, and I do planetary science as well, so they'll send spacecraft to get missions, and we can drown in data. There's all sorts of information. And there's something my engineer friends love to say as we're looking at different planets trying to learn something. How do we separate the signal from the noise? And that's a big deal. And I'm trained in it, my students are trained in it, looking at data in different ways, combining them in different ways to see if there are trends there, to see if some things make sense. Complete serendipity, I happen to be reading a popular science book by Geoffrey West, which is called Scale, but he is actually looking at, and he started looking at, and I thought this was crazy, the lifetime of cities, but also the lifetime of companies within cities as a function of size. And his big insight was one that was pure observation. And as scientists, this is also why I like the art connection, we're trained in observation. I like to actually tell people the English language has a different word, look and see, because the two don't mean the same thing. You can look at something casually and not see it, or you can try to see it. And I think that's the reason we say I see when an idea comes in, and that's scientific. Man, we're trained for that. Anyway, he just started to plot out, you know, the lifetime of companies versus the size of the companies to see a characteristic lifetime. And he did it in ways that scientific analysis will do, and he started to see trends no one had seen before. And that's just from looking at the raw data in a different way. So that was kind of cool. I happened to be reading that before I came. That's also something I'm really interested in. And in fact, the Skate Lab was really about generating new data and having students think about what it means and how to look at it. So those have been some of the connections that I've seen.
So what's been the hardest thing for you during your journey to get people to realize the power behind the framework of science? And how can we look at that framework to understand how it would benefit us in business?
So I guess I'll be blunt. The biggest thing that stood in my way is the inertia of history. That science was presented, in my opinion, the completely wrong way for a long, long time. And I think it still is. I mean, it pains me when people say I don't get science or I don't get math, and I go, that's ridiculous. If I thought that was the case, I'd go out and just end it all, right? I mean, that's what I do for a living, and if I thought most people couldn't appreciate it, man, that'd be depressing. It's really hard to change that conception, that misconception, that inertia. Now, I don't want to complain, and I don't mean to. Rice gives me complete freedom. But you can ask Anthony, restructuring a science class in a topic to make it about process versus the particular topic is not the easiest thing at an organization that carries some inertia with it. I'm going to be blunt, that's been the hardest thing to get over. On the positive side, a lot of people have started to appreciate this. From the education side, that there are certain tool sets that are valuable across the board. And if we're going to force people to sit into a science class, if they're not going to be the science majors, we should be thinking about those tool sets, not the facts, Jack, as they say. And a lot of that's also come from, as I mentioned, the cognitive science, when people realize how the brain works. And I read a lot of that when I was teaching. Phone numbers are 7 digits for a reason. The human mind can't go beyond that. Einstein's mind couldn't go beyond that. My mind certainly can't. Issues of memory hooks, things that with an analogy you'll actually be able to understand something better. And in fact, a lot of the analogies I might use when I'm teaching non-majors might be around, well, sports, because I know sports. But sometimes they were also around business and things that I knew they were majors in, if they happen to be music majors. And just seeing those connections and putting them together is great. The other thing that stands in the way, and again, I don't mean to be critical, and this is maybe my own thinking, there's a famous statement, I forget who made it. And this is from me as a university professor. And the statement is this: the world has problems, universities have departments. I'll let that sink in. I think it's true. The world doesn't care, and it doesn't discriminate between biology and business, to use one that's really actually made its way together of relate in a productive way. Nature doesn't care about that. Yet we still teach in these compartmentalized ways, and I think that gets in the way. I think what would really help, and I'd love to do it if I actually got to sit here and teach with a business instructor. I think that'd be all powerful. And I think it would be a benefit. So I hate to say it, that's to me what stands in the way. You can ask yourselves, I mean, probably you all come in with some preconception of what science is. I might come in with a preconception of what startup, but I take the time to try to get to know it, yeah.
You know, when I hear things like that, Ben, the first thing that comes to mind to me is what kind of experiment can we run at the Canon with Professor Lenardic and with a business professor like Neil Murthy, and let's see what it'll produce. And then let's look at that data, let's learn from it, and let's run another experiment, which kind of leads me to a question that Anthony and I came up with as we were drinking hot tea before we came to set up tonight. And we both want to know, and hopefully you guys will learn from something from this as well, is where do you see experiment design going in the future? Because what I want you guys to realize as entrepreneurs is you're constantly running experiments.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's what a startup is. And so if things are not connecting with you tonight in your thinking as far as what I'm asking Dr. Lenardic and what he's sharing, recognize that everything that you do is an experiment.
I'm so glad you said that. When people ask me what was one of the goals of Skate Lab, and I'm pretty modest about it to them, but to me it's actually not modest at all. It was to get people to rethink what experiment means. And unfortunately it's a word that's been so twisted around and so bastardized that it's lost its true meaning. That it's not people sitting in white lab coats or sitting in a chemistry lab and doing something. That's the way I learned it, unfortunately, and it wasn't good, and I stayed in science. Truth is, most science experiments don't work. They go wrong. They're not the ones that get written up in the history of it, but a lot of information is learned from it. That was one of the things. The other one is that you experiment all the time. Now, as an instructor, I can say that some people do experiments in a very sloppy way by my take. Changing a couple of variables at the same time as opposed to focusing on one versus another, and that can apply to whatever you do. So you can actually learn those methods, but it's there all the time, right? I mean, I experimented with rock and roll as a kid. Well, I won't go on, but you experiment with things to figure it out. You experiment with what medicine is going to make me feel better. You do it in a sloppy way, you know it's not going to be good. You are experimenting with businesses and startups and things like that, and if you do it in a sloppy way, you might reach a conclusion that's not the best one you can reach. That is 100% true.
You just gave me a new way to express to a founder or a CEO when they want to do something.
Yeah.
I'm going to, and it's against what my knowledge is that they need to do. So, for example, we're going to pick on something that Will and I talked about
Sure.
tonight. We were talking about crowdfunding and how important it is to actually, there's most of the work of a successful crowdfund happens before the crowdfund ever starts. And, Will turned to me and he's like, do you have that checklist in your head? And I'm like, yeah, I have that in my head, but let me tell you the problem with it. The problem is most CEOs, and most founders, and most entrepreneurs think they know more than me when it comes to that, and they won't listen to the advice. But what you just said allows me to kind of flip the tables on them, because now I can go, we can do it your way, which is the sloppy way, and we know in science that really causes all kinds of challenges, or
Well-
we can do it in a way that's actually going to allow us to see step by step, because that's exactly what O had talked about, who was the founder of Naki, who had the most successful crowdfund campaign in the state of Texas. Even though he had everything all lined out ahead of time, they paid attention to each step they took, and when they found a mistake, they stopped. They did some course correction, then they moved forward.
That sounds like science to me. That's how a scientist, that's how I test my ideas. Let me tell him something else you can tell him, or let me tell you something else you can tell him. The motto of one of the first scientific societies, actually science as a word didn't exist before around the 1600s. It was actually called natural philosophy. And then the word came into play. It was the Royal Society of London, and Newton sat on it. And they needed to decide what sums up what we do as scientists. And their motto was nullus in verba. Anthony's supposed to say what's nullus in verba. It's more Latin, sorry. Quite literally, it means nothing in words. And it means take no one's word for it, which means no argument from authority, which means if you think an idea is correct, you test it out. Doesn't matter if you're Einstein or not. Einstein was wrong about a lot of things. He knows that. He admitted it. Well, he's not around now anyway. But anyway, that's correct. And that aspect comes in, that you don't take anybody's word for it. And this is the hard one to get across to people, including your own. Including your own. Your mental models need to be tested. You can choose not to test them and just say, I think this is right and this is what I'm going to do. I don't know if that's going to lead to good or bad. Maybe you'll get lucky, but it's a matter of luck. Or you can think about systematically testing. And experimentation is that. Now, something that's changed, and it's changed the face of things, is the computer. And the computer is allowed for what are now called numerical experiments, where you actually set something up on the machine to actually run a potential experiment to see how variables might change. And that involves data and big data and how the data come in to change that. That is something I actually teach, by the way, but hopefully it's of use kind of across the board. So the people who are the programmers who do that and develop it have used it for science, but there are, I will tell you, there are a lot of business models out there that are numerical models, that are numerical experiments that are being tested out and changed as the data comes in. That's somewhat changed the face of experimentation, and now we talk about numerical experiments. There are advantages and there are disadvantages. One of the advantages is it's kind of cheaper. You can try out all sorts of things. The disadvantage is you have to know what the structure of that model is, and that's where a little technical help might be of benefit. But that's changed quite a bit. The other one that's been there forever, and sometimes we forget about it, is what's called the Gedanken experiment, and that's after Einstein, and it's a thought experiment. It means in your own mind you play out a scenario, and you think, what would happen if this? Now, Einstein is credited with saying that one of the happiest thoughts in his life was when he thought, what would it look like to me if I jumped off a building and let go of an apple? And he just thought it through. And it actually led to general relativity and the special theory of relativity. But it was just through that thinking, that curiosity, that training that he did it. I actually think that's something that can be trained in the mind of a person. And Anthony well knows, right? I give exams on it to actually train just that, to force you to do it, to put you in a situation where you have to think it through. If you're a curious person, that should happen all the time. But building up curiosity, I mean, it takes a little bit of effort. And as an educator, that's one of the things I see my role as, is to build that up. Stay curious, I guess. That's Iggy Pop, by the way.
So I'm just going to ask you some fun and fast questions right now before we go into our Q&A. So that means don't hesitate with the answer, just whatever the first thing is that pops into your mind. Okay? Well, so I'm going to ask you some and or questions.
The
You have
fact you
choices.
said that crazy guy is still here is for that reason, but go on.
All right, so steak or hamburger?
Oh, steak.
Ooh, you hesitated.
I did.
Chocolate
I
or
don't,
strawberry?
I've actually gone low meat, sorry.
That's okay. Chocolate or strawberry?
Chocolate,
Beach or mountains?
beach,
Range Rover or Ferrari?
Range Rover.
Where would you like to visit next you've never gone to?
It's a combination of two. I've never been to Africa, so I would love to go to South Africa. A couple of reasons, culture, scenery, all that. I'm an ex-surfer too, so Super Tubes is there, and it's a beautiful spot.
Well, you know what? I know a lot of people in South
Oh,
Africa.
cool.
So when you go, let me know ahead of time. I'll introduce you to you. You'll have a family before you even get there.